Hi guys, and welcome to the Ace Tanker for the M3 Lee. There have been some of you that have been waiting for a long time for me to say that. I've been waiting a long time to say that, but not for lack of trying. It's simply that I just didn't fancy getting into this tank again and playing it, but over the last 18 months, the M3 Lee has probably been the most requested Ace Tanker. I've just been asked by so many people, or challenged by so many people to get the Ace in the M3 Lee, and I've delayed it. I delayed it because I was getting Ace Tankers on other nations, or I delayed it because I was getting Ace Tankers on other American tanks, and I left it as long as I could. But I aced all the other low-tier Americans, or at least most of them, before the change to the T18 and the T82. I'm gonna have to go back and play those tanks now, but yeah, the M3 Lee finally got around to playing it. It probably took between 12 and 18 games to get the Ace. Yeah, it was surprisingly difficult. It was surprisingly difficult, mainly because it's not a very good tank. I really don't enjoy this tank, but it's not as bad as people say. The tank has strengths, the tank has a lot of weaknesses, but I don't think the M3 Lee is as bad as people say, but I still don't think it's one of the strongest tier 4s. In fact, it's probably one of the weakest tier 4s of the game, but it's not bad because it does have some strengths. It's got decent signal range, which is more important at low tier, and it's got an absolutely amazing gun. Yes, it's an amazing gun. I will admit that about the M3 Lee. It is the 75mm that you will see on later tanks, but 92mm of penetration and 110 damage. Now, 110 damage is very, very good, especially at tier 4. The 92mm of penetration is okay. It's going to struggle against tier 5s and tier 6s, especially heavy tanks, but when it's up against lightly armored tanks or in a tier 4 game, 92mm of penetration is actually okay. So yeah, it's got a decent gun. The aim time is good. The accuracy is not great, but it's okay. And what is absolutely amazing about this gun is its DPM. Now, are you ready for this? Are you sitting down? Because what a lot of people don't realize about the M3 Lee is it gets 2,200 DPM. 2,200 DPM. This is not a derp gun. It's not firing HE. This is not a tier 8. There are tier 8 medium tanks that would love to have 2,200 DPM. The Mutz that I recently featured on the channel, that tank has 1,800 DPM, or just over 1,800 DPM. The M3 Lee has 2,200 DPM. It's a medium tank, it's a tier 4, and it has better DPM than most tier 8 mediums. So the DPM on this tank doesn't get talked about enough. It is incredibly good. You can tear enemy tanks apart very, very quickly. So very, very good gun. The gun traverse is actually okay. Now, the thing about the gun traverse arc is, yeah, we're talking about gun traverse arc, and it's a medium tank, so normally we talk about gun traverse arc in a tank destroyer. But of course that's one of the M3 Lee's problems, because the 75mm is mounted in a sponson, and that means it's forward facing just like a tank destroyer. And as a result, a lot of people say, including myself in the past, that you should maybe play the M3 Lee more like a tank destroyer than a medium tank. And while that advice holds, I do advise you to maybe play this a little bit more passively, a little bit more like a tank destroyer when you're not top tier. If you're in a tier 6 game, then definitely play this tank a little bit more passively, play it more like a tank destroyer, because you've only got 310 hit points, and tier 6 tanks are going to tear you apart. When you're top tier in a tier 4 game, like this one is, in fact, this is an incredibly tier 4 game. I wish this happened more often at every tier. There's only one tier 3 in this entire game, and he's on the enemy team. Everyone else is tier 4, so I don't know why they can't do this at tier 10, tier 8, tier 9. Why can't we have all tier 8s? An all tier 8 game. They do happen, but they happen very rarely. I would rather see, you know, matchmaking where everyone is the same tier, unless there aren't enough tanks in the queue, at which point, you know, you get matchmaking more like it is today, where you get bottom tier, mid tier, and low tier. But yeah, I don't understand why Wargaming can't do that, but this is an all tier 4 game, there or thereabouts, so the gun is going to be very, very good. The mobility of the tank is okay. It's fast enough in a straight line, but the traverse speed is not great. But yeah, I think the M3 Lee is quite competitive, especially when it gets top tier. So it's not as bad as people say. So talking about the history of the tank, there's a heck of a lot of history about the M3 Lee, guys, and I'm only going to be covering this very, very briefly. I know some of you guys tune in when I talk about the history of the tank because that's what interests you. But on my Facebook page, I recently put a link up to a video about the M3 Lee. It's a 45-minute video about its history, and it is incredibly interesting. In fact, I'm quite regularly putting World War II tank videos up on my Facebook page if you haven't checked that out. Just videos that I've watched and I found very, very interesting. It's where I get a lot of my information from, actually. I watch a lot of videos about tanks. But the M3 Lee came into existence in 1940. So it came into existence right at the start of World War II, shortly after Britain had retreated from the beaches of Dunkirk and left all their armour sitting on the beaches. They had no armour. They were desperate. They were fearing a German invasion. They asked America for help. Now, Britain needed tanks, but America also had its own problems because America, running up to World War II, during the pre-war years, America had actually been cutting back. They'd been reducing funding on the armored forces. So the armored forces of the US weren't very strong in the late 1930s. In fact, they mainly relied on the M2 medium tank as their main tank. Now, the problem is that the British had run into the new German tanks, the new Panzers, and the M2 medium was just not going to cut it. It was a tank that was usually armed with a 37mm, and it wasn't considered competitive enough against new German armour. So while America didn't have tank designs, what they did have was production lines. They had a lot of car manufacturers that were ready to switch over to tank building. So they needed a very, very quick fix. So they started developing the M4 Sherman, but in the meantime, Russia were crying out for tanks, Britain were crying out for tanks, and America really only had the M2 medium to send them, which wasn't good enough. So very quickly they put this thing together, which is the M3 Lee. Now what this is, or it was the M3 Grant when it was finally shipped to Britain, but it was an M2 chassis that was modified. The 37mm was still on the tank, but the gun was considered inferior, so therefore it was decided to put a 75mm on the tank to make it competitive against German tanks. Now, the problem was that, as I say, the designs weren't there. So the only turrets that the US had were turrets that were basically too small and couldn't mount a 75mm. So they couldn't mount the gun in a turret. As a result, they decided to mount the 75mm in the hull of the tank, and they had to build a sponson in order to fit the gun. They still put a turret on the tank with a 37mm, but the main gun was in the hull. So these were the tanks that were designed. The M3 Lee was designed. It was named after General Robert E. Lee from the American Civil War. And about 6,000 of these were built between 1940 and 1941. Now, of the 6,000 M3 Lees, or just over 6,000 that were built, about 3,000 of them were shipped to Britain, and they were renamed the M3 Grant, and about 1,400 or 13 or 1,400, depending on what source you read, were shipped to the US or the USSR as part of the Lend-Lease program. So most of the M3 Lees that were actually built were used by Britain and Russia. In fact, more tanks, M3 Lees, were used by Britain and Russia than actually the US when the US finally entered the war. But yeah, the M3 Lee, when it finally saw action, or when it first saw action, it was with the British. It wasn't with the Americans. It didn't see action with the Americans till much later. So it saw action with the British in North Africa. And when the M3 Lee arrived on the scene, I got a lot of abuse on previous M3 Lee videos, because I talked about how bad the tank was, or I made jokes about the tank, and a lot of people jumped to the tank's defense and said it was amazing. Yeah, I mean, yeah, those people, I guarantee you guys have not driven M3 Lees if anyone is watching this. Yes, by all accounts, when the M3 Lee first arrived on the scene with its 75mm, you've got to remember that this tank came to the war at a time when the British only had very, very few Churchills. They were mainly using Matildas and Valentines, and those tanks couldn't compete in North Africa. So for the M3 Lee to arrive on the scene, it had a 75mm gun, which was much better than anything the British already had. It was fast and reliable, which was better than anything the British had. Remember, the British were focusing on infantry tanks, very slow-moving tanks, and the M3 Lee was like a sports car compared to them when the M3 Lee first arrived on scene. So a lot of British tankers liked the M3 Lee over the tanks they had been driving because it was more competitive against German armour. But that still doesn't excuse all the problems. The first problem was that the M3 Lee just wasn't manoeuvrable once it got off-road. It might have been quick on road, but once it got into the sands, the desert sands, the manoeuvrability wasn't amazing. Also, it had the problem, as I say, of the 75mm not being mounted in the turret. The turret physically didn't exist at that time that could mount this gun. So it couldn't go hull down. It couldn't use traditional tank tactics of going hull down and using this gun. It was a very tall tank, very tall profile, and the armour wasn't particularly good. It was okay, but compared to even some of the British tanks at that time, the armour wasn't amazing. And yes, it could, gun-wise, compete with the tanks in the early Desert Wars, 1941, 1942. Basically, by about mid-1942, it was outclassed, because prior to 1942, when the M3 Lee was first introduced, it was up against Panzer IIs, and it was up against Panzer IIIs, very few Panzer IVs, and the Panzer IVs it was up against weren't using the long 75mm. So it could outgun those tanks. It was good enough to face those tanks, but as soon as Panzer IVs with the long 75 started arriving on the battlefield, as soon as Tigers started arriving on the battlefield, the Panther hadn't been developed by then, the tank was just incredibly outclassed. And as I say, by about 1942, late 1942, when the M4 Sherman started arriving on scene, the M3 Lee was very, very quickly phased out in favour of the M4 Sherman. It was just too big, too easy to hit, and couldn't go hull down. Big issues, especially when you're fighting in the desert. The tank, even the M3 Lee, even had more problems in Russia. When it was first shipped to Russia, as I say, about 1,200, 1,300 of them were shipped to Russia. The Russians hated it, absolutely hated it. They called it, in fact, the Russians nicknamed this tank the Coffin. Or I think it was Coffin for Seven Brothers was the full Russian translation, because it had a crew of 7, because it just got taken out too easily. The M3 Lee was very, very susceptible to infantry with anti-tank weapons, and yeah, it wasn't reliable in Russian winter, Russian weather. So the Russians absolutely hated this tank when it first arrived on the scene, and about as many M3 Lees were in use by the Russians as were by the Americans when the Americans finally entered the war. So the tank really, the British liked it because it was better than what they had. The Russians absolutely hated it, and yeah, I think a lot of people who try to defend the M3 Lee as a good tank are looking at reports of maybe when the tank first came on the scene in 1940, 1941, when it was competitive and it was better than any of the tanks that had gone before it, but it very, very quickly became obsolete. By about 1942, pretty much they'd been replaced by M4 Shermans. The remaining M3 Lees were shipped to other combat theaters. They saw a lot of combat in the Pacific, and there they didn't have to come up against enemy tanks all that often. They did have tank battles in the Pacifics during the war against Japan, but Japan really didn't have very many tanks that could compete. And once again, the M3 Lee it was too susceptible to being taken out by infantry with anti-tank weapons. That was exactly the same problem the Russians had been facing. The Americans faced exactly the same problem when it came to the war in the Pacific. So yeah, the M3 Lee, it's not as bad as people say. It's not as bad as people joke about, but it definitely wasn't a great tank. As I say, about 6,000 of them were manufactured, but most of the tanks that were manufactured were shipped overseas to Britain and Russia. But anyway, there we go for the history. If I haven't bored the pants off you, we're finally going to get to this ace tanker. So we're here on Ensk. It's an old Tier 4 game. And as I say, what I might actually do is I might post the link to that very interesting documentary I found about the M3 Lee. I'll post it underneath this video just in case some of you guys don't have Facebook or haven't seen the video already. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a nest. This is what I do if I'm in a tank destroyer, and I figured, you know what, I might as well do the same thing in a M3 Lee. So I'm making basically 2 lines of cover here. I thought the AMX-40 was going to steal my spot, but now what you can see is I've got 3 lines of concealment, 3 rows of bushes, because I pushed down the trees, and as a result I am completely hidden. Even in an M3 Lee I am hidden. So what you're going to see here, excuse me, is look at the rate of fire compared to the alpha damage. We can just go to work here. Nope, missed that one. So as long as your team don't push up, of course this position is only useful as long as the enemy team are advancing. If your team have advanced and pushed up, there we go, first kill. If your team have pushed up, you're not going to get shots like this, so just be aware. You can start the game here, but if your team are being aggressive, then this position is no longer viable. And as you can see here, my team are being aggressive, so we've got a Panzer B2 moving up, we've got an AMX-40 moving up, so we're going to hang around here, get a couple more shots if we can. Oh, missed that one. So the accuracy is not amazing, but yeah, as I say, my team are pushing up, enemy team aren't pushing, so now I have to advance. So there's a T-28 out here. Remember what I said about the penetration? Yeah, side of a T-28, not the most accurate gun, bounced on a T-28 that had absolutely no armor. So the penetration, if it's, you know, you're going to bounce shots in Tier 4 games, you're going to bounce a heck of a lot more in Tier 5 and Tier 6 games. So I'm just looking for shots here. I've got a hint of a shot at the Hetzer, but I decided not to go for it because there are better targets in front of me. So you can see I'm working my gun around a right-hand corner, trying to keep as much of my tank hidden as possible. But that rate of fire, this T-28E F-30 just does not realize how quick my rate of fire is. Now I'm risking shots around this AMX-40, but we're up to 1100 damage already. And this is where I thought I didn't have an ace. I was thinking right up till this point, this is a potential ace. Maybe we can do it this game. Lots of tanks in front of me, but the problem is there's a Hetzer waiting around the corner. So the first thing is he's got a bush in front of him. I can't see what gun this guy has. If this guy has a derp gun, I'm in trouble. This guy could potentially one-hit kill me, but then I notice it's not a derp gun. But we have an STVZ-39 and an AMX-40 moving up, and I'm going, guys, please distract him. He's pre-aimed. He's pre-aimed on my corner. Okay, they're distracting him. Now I've got to go, and you can see my gun. It's on the right-hand side of the tank, so yeah, I thought the ace was gone at this point. A lot of the enemy tanks are now dead. I wasted so much time here. Because the gun was on the right-hand side of my tank, I had to expose the entire left-hand side in order to get my gun on target, at which point he was dead. So I've just wasted about 45 seconds on that Hetzer, and enemy tanks are dying too quickly, and I'm thinking to myself, damn it. I messed around with the Hetzer for too long. Maybe I should have taken the hit. It's not going to be an ace. Maybe if I can pick up a couple of remaining kills, but unfortunately the AMX-40 is in the north of the map. But shot on the move. This gun is not amazing at shooting on the move, but we hit that one, so we're just chasing down this Coventry. As you can see, we're doing 40 kilometers an hour in a straight line. We take him out to finish up the game, and yep, 3 kills and 1400 damage. So there you go, guys, and not surprisingly, I sold this tank straight after this game. There's no way I'm keeping an M3 Lee in my garage. I know some of you out there are going to defend the M3 Lee, but I don't think. I've read so much about the M3 Lee. I've watched the documentaries about the M3 Lee. I know that the M3 Lee was okay at best and outclassed very, very quickly and very, very easily. So it's not a great tank in game, and most of the time we talk about the M3 Lee, we're talking about it in game because this is a channel that's primarily devoted to World of Tanks. So yes, okay, I may be a little bit unfair to the M3 Lee as it was in real life, but we're talking about a computer game here. This is a tank you wanted to see. This is the tank you wanted to force me to play. It was not fun. I don't appreciate it. They require requests to have played this tank because you just wanted me to suffer. I know how you guys think, but we aced it and we picked up high caliber. We finished top on XP with 870 or 857, which, you know, I thought maybe I could have had a better game. As I say, I was a little bit disappointed I didn't do more at the end there. Wasted too much time on a hetzer. Probably could have taken a hit. And 1300, almost 1400 damage. As I say, the DPM on this tank is absolutely amazing. And when you get it into the right circumstances, this is, you know, the DPM is just underestimated. It's got better DPM than most tier 8 mediums, and it's a tier 4. So that is one strength, as I say, you don't hear a lot of people talk about. We fired 20, hit 16, bend 14. Even against other tier 4s, against lightly armored targets, we bounced a couple of shots. We spotted 3, damaged 7, destroyed 3, did 47 assistance or 46 assistance damage, which is next to nothing, and earned 30,000 credits with a premium account. It was my first game of the day. Thankfully, didn't sit down and play lots of games on this tank on this particular day. I was just playing the daily doubles, playing it once every day to save myself suffering too much. But yeah, it was. I'm glad I got it out of the way. So yeah, I sold the M3 Lee straight after this game, and I bought the M4A2 E4 or E8. I bought the Easy 8 after this tank because the Easy 8 is another tank I didn't get an ace in. So, believe it or not, bought the Easy 8, put equipment on it, put a crew in it, and got the ace in the very first game. So this was back-to-back ace tankers. It's been a while since I've done that. M3 Lee is done, and I'm going to be bringing you the back-to-back ace tanker. The Easy 8 is coming up on the channel in a short while. You're going to get 2 videos very, very quickly in succession because they were played very quickly in succession. And as I'm celebrating 4,000 subscribers, guys, as per usual, if you leave a comment on this video, if you're still watching and you leave a comment, I'm going to be giving away 2 Steam games with this particular video. So I'm going to announce prize winners in a future video, but I've got a lot of Steam keys I want to give away. I'm going to be giving away 2 more on this particular video. So anyway, for all of you guys who've been requesting that I play this tank, you can stop requesting it now. It's on the channel, it's done, it's dusted, it's sold, and you can stop annoying me. You can start requesting other horrible tanks. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.